Well, it's been a little while since my introductory video on Lies of P Overture, the game's DLC expansion that at least initially turned out to be considerably harder than I was expecting. I was hoping to have released more videos on it by now, but I've been away on holiday pretty much since that video came out. The timing wasn't great. But, that being said, having got back home, I have just completed the expansion as of last night, and I'll have more to say on it holistically in the coming days. Before that, however, before anything else, I want to address what I think is a pretty rough starting point for Overture itself, and that's the introduction of perhaps Lies of P's worst boss ever, Tyrannical Predator. And it's a shame to have to say that because when it comes to the base game, and I mentioned this in my recent ranking of the Lies of P boss fights, I think Lies of P boasts a fantastic, well-balanced catalogue of boss fights, the majority of which are fun to take down, challenging, rewarding, and above all else, fair. Again, as you can see in my recent difficulty ranking. But the first boss of Lies of P Overture caps off what I think is an unbalanced, dramatically difficult opening section of the expansion with a difficulty spike that at least I didn't find was really replicated anywhere else, even within Overture itself, having now finished it. And so I have to ask the question, is Tyrannical Predator, the first boss of Lies of P Overture, the game's worst boss ever? Not just from the expansion, but from Lies of P as a whole. In today's video, I want to take a look at the Tyrannical Predator boss fight, why it doesn't seem to work, especially in comparison with many of the game's other boss fights, and how it exists contextually within that opening portion of the DLC, as well as give a few thoughts on the DLC itself too, so let's get started. Remember to hit subscribe down below, guys, if you like what you see. Once again, a massive thank you to everyone who helped us reach 13,000 subs. It really does mean the absolute world, and your support is greatly appreciated. So if you want to support the channel and you want to see more videos just like this one, then hit subscribe down below. It really would make a massive difference. So, Tyrannical Predator, which is a really cool name to be fair, is the very first boss of Lies of P Overture, and acts as the capstone to the entire opening portion of the expansion, Krat Zoo, which itself was the single hardest zone of the game, at least for me anyway. In fact, my previous video on Overture, the only one I've made so far, discussed how I was shocked at how surprisingly difficult Krat Zoo actually was, from regular enemies, even those that were carried over from the base game who could suddenly kill me in 2 hits, to of course the newer, even more vicious foes. The giant apes, the packs of dogs, the savage kangaroos, and of course topping it off was the enormous elephant giraffe abomination, which took me quite a long time to finally bring down. It was akin to a boss fight itself. And again, this is all on the Legendary Stalker difficulty, which at least as far as I'm aware is meant to closely replicate the game's original 2023 state, the way I originally finished the game back in the day. So, as I progressed through this portion of the DLC, frankly struggling the entire way as is well documented, I wondered what might be waiting for me at the end of the road. Krat Zoo, again, is an awesome area. It is so unique, and like nothing else the game has to offer, and that goes a long way. It's very memorable, and in spite of the difficulty, it is a lot of fun to explore and soak in the surroundings. As I mentioned in my previous video on the DLC, the sheer depth of the depravity of what's taken place at the zoo, and the way so many of the creatures have been twisted beyond belief, it is wonderful environmental storytelling that really gives Lies of P much more of a true horror vibe than it's really ever had before, specifically employing monstrous body horror. But I like that it all takes place in the middle of the day. There's no escaping beneath the light of the sun the abject terror of what occurred here, as so much of it still lingers. But after pushing through, after kind of bashing my head against the elephant monster for what felt like forever, I finally made it to the DLC's first boss, Tyrannical Predator, a gigantic mutated crocodile that bursts up out of the ice before you. and it kind of confirmed everything that I had feared about Overture up until that point. Everything that, strangely, in a way I never expected, doesn't ever really rear its head ever again after this first boss, however. Even when taking into account the mini-bosses in Lies of P's base game, I can't think of a single boss that is reminiscent of Tyrannical Predator or the way it fights. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. Now, the issue doesn't stem from the fact that Tyrannical Predator is hard, though it is that too, but more from how it fights and how it feels almost antithetical to everything that Lies of P has been up until then. Now again, Tyrannical Predator does fit with both the visual and gameplay themes of Krat Zoo and Overture's opening area in general. As one of these new animal enemies, it really ups the ante in what feels like an enormous, unprecedented way, and introduces a brand new approach to enemy encounters and confrontations. This isn't a boss that can realistically be fought in the same way you'd take on most Lies of P bosses. And in fact, Tyrannical Predator reminds me of some of From Software's own less than agreeable animal bosses of recent memory, the likes of the Golden Hippopotamus from Shadow of the Erd Tree, and even Night Rain's own Adele Baron of Night. These bosses all have wide, sweeping, and wildly unreliable attacks, lunges, and grabs, whose erratic hitboxes play havoc with a game where the combat is so often determined by a hair's breadth, whether that's a perfectly timed parry or an elusive split-second dodge. Bosses like this, like I said, are antithetical to the methodical nature of the combat found in most Souls games, and yes, most Souls-likes. Outside of a scant few bosses, Lies of P in particular emphasised parrying above all else, but the truth is that the Tyrannical Predator boss breaks most of the rules that this game has lived by. Tyrannical Predator, therefore, is dropped into a game where parrying used to be king, and now asks you, generally speaking, to dodge instead. But unlike certain bosses from the base game, the likes of Romeo, for example, it uses attacks that make dodging completely unreliable. Less about skill and timing, and more about getting lucky, or at least that's how it can feel, that's how it can be perceived. That's why bosses like Tyrannical Predator can often feel unfair to players. You know what you're supposed to do to stay alive, but doing so can often feel like a crapshoot. Tyrannical Predator even has one particular lunge move that honestly feels like it is missing frames. It's designed almost to come out of nowhere as it suddenly springs at you. So the problems with Tyrannical Predator are numerous. As with the rest of the Krat Zoo area, even when sporting an enormous health bar, this boss can kill you in just a couple of hits, and when your response isn't reliable, that can be incredibly frustrating to deal with. Tyrannical Predator's gigantic, elongated jaw makes understanding hitboxes that much harder, again, very similarly to Golden Hippopotamus and Adele Baron of Night, and Tyrannical Predator's weird, squat-like attacks where it tries to almost fall on you are equally strange to deal with. The issues with this croc extend beyond its moveset, however. Really, its moveset is probably the least of its problems. The beast is enormous, and Souls games have historically been very hit or miss when it comes to giant bosses, usually for one specific reason. The camera itself becomes unmanageable. Locking on can often be a detriment, and the same is true here, especially with Tyrannical Predator's massive jaw to contend with. It's easy to find the crocodile taking up virtually the entire screen as it bears down upon you, and blind, you're just left again to hope and pray that you'll come out of a clash with it with enough health, stamina, and time, crucially, to back away and heal. On top of this, the arena is small and littered with obstacles that you can easily get stuck on. This is kind of reminiscent of the green monster of the swamp. Another fairly big boss, albeit not quite as big as this one, but one who gets really up in your face in a small arena and can quite quickly encompass the entire camera space. While the boss is doable, obviously, did it have to be quite this problematic to face? Now, that's not to say Tyrannical Predator is completely unmanageable. Ultimately, the enormous croc only has, what is it, like 5 or 6 total moves? It is a big, lumbering beast for the most part. It is not the deepest moveset in the game, and actually several of its moves can and should probably be parried. For example, the tail spin it uses after a certain combo is fairly easy to block, as are some of its lunges. Not only that, but employing the usual tactic against huge bosses does kind of work, sticking to one side of the creature as best you can, and it's fairly vulnerable to fire or really most status ailments it seems like, and you can whittle down its health fairly effectively. My issues then with Tyrannical Predator honestly center mostly around how, I mean, broken isn't the right word, of course, but it doesn't feel like it fits with the flow of Lies of P whatsoever, and maybe that's the point. But I personally found it noticeable that Markiona, the DLC's first true boss, and the one who comes after Tyrannical Predator, is just a far superior boss fight in every single way, and ultimately considerably fairer and much more satisfying to defeat. And like I said at the top of this video, no other boss in Lies of P is really like this. And yet, maybe every Souls game should be allocated one boss of this style, one boss that seems to brazenly flout the established rules of the game. Maybe it could be argued that for the base game, that boss would be the Black Rabbit Brotherhood, or maybe even the aforementioned Green-Eyed Monster, but ultimately I stick by what I said at the top of this video, that I think Lies of P's base game has a fantastic catalogue of bosses, the vast majority of which do feel very fair and very satisfying to defeat. Even Black Rabbit Brotherhood, I think, is a novel and frankly clever way of doing a gank boss fight. So yeah, that's how I feel about Lies of P Overture's first boss, Tyrannical Predator, and crucially, how I feel about the way this particular boss closed out that particular section of the DLC. It was fun, it was creative and different, which I value a lot, but it all feels enormously overtuned for really no reason at all. Now, it could be argued, of course, that Markiona is technically the expansion's true first boss, but I mean, Tyrannical Predator, at least as far as I'm aware, can't be avoided. Maybe the idea behind the Krat Zoo section of the game is simply to weed out the players who aren't good enough for the expansion yet. And again, I found Krat Zoo to be way harder than Markiona's own area, the greenhouse, just on a completely different level. But weeding players out, isn't that the purpose of locking the expansion behind Chapter 9 in the first place? Or I think maybe Chapter 5 now after the update, I can't remember exactly, but I can't imagine the Krat Zoo section of the DLC, for as cool as it is enormously satisfying for anyone, and then to top it off with the worst boss of the entire game is a real shame. But moving on from the opening section, what struck me the most about Overture so far is the fact that the DLC simply becomes considerably easier after defeating the Tyrannical Predator. At least some of the sections between boss fights do. Krat Zoo is littered with absurdly powerful enemies, but once the enemies became puppets again, I couldn't help but find the overall difficulty dropped off a cliff. And that goes for the so-called elite enemies that you fight as well. For example, early in the carnival area, which is a fantastically cool area by the way, you face off against none other than the Parade Master again, the first boss of the base game. Except here he is all shiny and new, which was a really cool little like lore reference. It was really awesome to see him like that. And maybe it's simply because I fought him before, but he was just so much easier to kill than the giant elephant giraffe monstrosity. I think it took me 2 attempts max, despite them ostensibly holding similar positions in their respective zones. And this kind of carried on as well. The human alchemist enemies really weren't that much trouble, and the new and returning carcass enemies were again mostly fine too. It almost feels like Krat Zoo specifically was massively overtuned, like the difficulty there is ramped up beyond belief, while the rest of Overture doesn't feel too absurd by comparison. And unless I'm completely off base with that thought, I do wonder what the logic really is. Considering I defeated Tyrannical Predator before going away, and I don't believe the game had been updated by that point. The greenhouse area seemed a lot easier. Maybe the update had come in since, and I'd be interested to see what your thoughts are on that. Whether or not you think the Overture DLC did get considerably easier after the Predator, I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. But that being said, I mean, some of the later bosses are still completely over the top as well. While I think Tyrannical Predator is the game's worst boss mechanically, the way it plays out, the way it's executed, honestly, Veronique could have quite easily taken that spot as well. Just a ridiculous human fight, the likes of which I don't think you would ever find in the base game. Specifically, these mini-bosses seem to be tuned up to a completely crazy level, though the Lumacchio boss later on was actually pretty good. But anyway, these are just some rambling thoughts to close out the video with. I'll have a more concrete discussion on Overture very shortly, as like I said, I'm done with the expansion now. But my current impressions, I think, are decidedly more mixed than I was expecting. It's not quite the slam dunk across the board that I thought Lies of P was. It feels messier, it feels unbalanced, at least at the beginning anyway, and less satisfying. But at the same time, I love the concept, I love the world, and the narrative is excellent too, and the new characters are also wonderful. Leah is one of my favourite characters in the entire lore now, I think. And she's just so awesome as well, like a fantastic design, one of the coolest characters in the game. Speaking of one of the coolest characters in the game, the follow-up video to this will be an inverse of sorts, looking at how Overture's bosses, while also being some of the very worst that Lies of P has to offer, also are some of the absolute best, if not the best, in the entire game as well, so stay tuned for that, that's coming soon. But anyway, there is a lot to discuss here, so I'll hold my further thoughts back for now, but these were just some additional thoughts on the DLC too before we wrap things up, specifically talking about its difficulty. But alright guys, that's it for today's video. As always, I do hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. How do you feel about the Tyrannical Predator boss, the very first boss of the Lies of P Overture DLC expansion? Do you think it was the worst boss in the game? How do you rate it in comparison to the other bosses found throughout both Lies of P's base game and the DLC? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. Am I off base here? Let me know how you feel about this video. I'd love to know. Alright everyone, once again, thank you so very much for watching. Consider hitting subscribe down below if you enjoyed the video and want to see more just like this one. It would really help support the channel. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and let's talk games again.